A recent study came out and said that 1 million Americans, I want that to sink in for you. A recent study just said that 1 million Americans will stop going to church in 2015. 1 million Americans will stop going to church in 2015. Now, we've talked about this before. The fastest growing religious affiliation in the United States today is N-O-N-E-S, the nuns, not the N-U-Ns, not the ones with the habits, but the N-O-N-E-S, the euphemistically referred to as the unaffiliated. The culture in our country today is decidedly turning more secular and less religious. From a high point in the 1950s where 70% of Americans called themselves churchgoers, to now that number is dwindling over and over and year after year. And to be fair, Christian denominations all over the country are running, screaming into the night, wondering what's going on. What's the reason for this? Why are people stop going to church? Well, lots of reasons, I'm sure. We're very busy. By the way, did you know that the number one reason why church attendance has dropped in the United States, you know what it is? Kids' sports activities. The number one reason why attendance in church in the last several decades has gone down, the number one reason is kids' sports activities scheduled on Sunday morning. Why, that's the only time we could find. Why, that's the only time we could do it. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, the very fact that we feel the freedom to schedule our sporting events on a Sunday morning isn't the problem, it's the symptom. Do you understand? So why are people stop going to church? I don't know, this hasn't really affected us that much because 5 years ago when we were blessed to come here as the parish priest, last week was 5 years. I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. The Sunday before we got here in that transition period, I understand there were about 35 people in church on that Sunday. And now look at us. So we're kind of bucking the trend, which is fine with me. I don't have a problem with that. But the challenge is, why do we Americans feel less religiously connected? Now notice this. I want you to notice that at the same time a church attendance is dropping, the number of Americans who call themselves, I love this, spiritual is skyrocketing. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Well, isn't that precious? There are lots of reasons why, and we could sit here and we could go over tons and tons of statistics and talk about graphs and surveys and all that kind of stuff. But the bottom line is, ladies and gentlemen, would you like to know my take on it? I'd like to share it with you since I have the floor. I'll go ahead and do that. I think people are becoming more honest. I think folks are becoming more honest. Whereas before, there was almost a cultural pressure for you to show up in church on Sunday morning. And if you wanted to do business in a town, if you wanted to do business with this company or that company, then you had to show yourself what we used to call an upstanding member of the community. And an upstanding member of the community goes to church. Well, that facade has now been removed from modern America, and the true devotion of men's hearts is being revealed. And that's not a bad thing, folks. It's just not pleasant. It's not a bad thing to finally come to understand what you truly, at the core of your being, actually believe, and what you don't believe. And so the challenge becomes, how are we to deal with this outbreak of honesty among our people? I think we deal with it just like they're dealing with it. We're honest. Jesus confronts a situation very similar, at least the situation of confusion, very similar, when a man brings to the Lord his young son who's an epileptic, and this disease is killing this boy. And the man brings to the Lord his son and says, Lord, I brought him to your disciples and they couldn't heal him. And then Jesus, almost if you read it, it sounds like he's annoyed, doesn't it? It sounds like he's bothered. I don't know about you, but that just kind of flies in the face of my Sunday school vision of Jesus with a smiling face and almost like a doting grandfather. Come, go, yes, come. And yet that's not the image we get here of the Lord at all in the gospel. We see Jesus say to them, how long am I going to put up with you folks? Bring the boy to me. And he brings the boy, and then he says this before he says that. He says, you wicked and perverse generation. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Jesus dealt with the lack of faith, the smallness of faith, with honesty. Now, that honesty wasn't pleasant. It wasn't even, you might even call it impolite. But it was what was necessary to break through the facade of the people around them thinking that they didn't need anything more. They didn't need to progress any further. They didn't need to grow in their faith. They didn't need to develop their faith. They didn't need to be honest about their own need to become more mature in their faith. And so because of that blindness, Jesus, in his love for his hearers, speaks very plainly to them in the hopes that the honesty coming from the Son of God would rouse the souls of the people around them to wake up to the reality of their situation. Well, of course, Jesus heals the boy. And then the disciples pulled Jesus off to the side quietly and said, Lord, why couldn't we do this? And Jesus again answers his disciples honestly, because of your little faith. Because of your little faith. You see, ladies and gentlemen, there is a consequence to little faith. The consequence to little faith is mediocrity. Katalavete. The consequence to little faith is mediocrity and a commitment to mediocrity and an exaltation of mediocrity to a virtue, because anything beyond mediocrity disturbs my carefully coiffured existence. A commitment to mediocrity allows me to sit quietly in my own little world and in the great sin of the modern age of gross individualism, saying me and Jesus got our own thing going. The sin of mediocrity allows me to be undisturbed in my smallness, to be undisturbed in my spiritual illness. The sickness of mediocrity, the little faith that is maintenance by please don't say unpleasant things to me. Please don't tell me unpleasant truths. Please don't disturb my equilibrium with hard facts. The sickness of small faith, the sin of mediocrity allows me to slowly slip to my death, asleep to my need. And so Jesus Christ, the lover of humanity, speaks plainly to his hearers about the dangers of little faith, and then he goes further. Not only did he disturb me with honesty and clarity, he then says, your faith is so little it doesn't even equal the grain of a mustard seed. Do you know what you ever seen a mustard seed? Years ago when I was a boy, we had this fad in the evangelical Protestant world that I was growing up in, where we had this little necklace or even a little ring that had a little mustard seed in a piece of glass that you could look at it. And they had to magnify, the glass had to be a magnifier so you could actually see the mustard seed, because the mustard seed is not even as big as the tip of your itty bitty pinky. It's just not big. So Lord, if we understand you correctly, what you've just told us is, our little faith is the reason why we couldn't cast this out. We needed prayer and fasting. We needed to be actively involved in developing our spiritual life. so that we could cast this out. And you're telling me our little faith is the problem, and our faith is even smaller than a grain of mustard seed? And then Jesus goes on to say, but if you had that kind of faith, as the grain of a mustard seed, you could say to a mountain, move. That's why I always get tickled when people start getting worried and nervous about, what are we going to do in the church? What are we going to do in the church? What are we just going to, we need to do, what are we going to do? And they get all upset and worked up and get nervous. How are we going to pay our bills? I said, well, folks, I always tell people, folks, we never have a money problem in church. Do you understand that? There's no such thing as a money problem in church. Did you know that the Greek Orthodox community, the Greek American community in the United States, is the second wealthiest community in the United States? We do not have a money problem. We have a mustard seed problem. We have a problem of men and women prioritizing their faith more than their own comfort. That's the problem we have. We have a problem of men and women failing to be awakened by the truth to the reality of what's most valuable. And brothers and sisters, beyond any shadow of a doubt, you're never going to do anything this week more important than you're doing right now. Not a thing. Feeding your soul, which is going to last forever, rather than pampering your body, which is going to go into a hole, makes more sense than wasting your time prioritizing your life with backward priorities. And so the faith offers us the invitation to be stirred from the slumber of the sin of small faith and mediocrity, to wake up to our true need. To understand that it is through prayer and fasting that we will progress in our spiritual lives, because through an active participation in our faith, not allowing our faith to be nothing more than some decoration to our life, but actually become the center of our existence. It's the reason why the Orthodox faith has survived 20 centuries in the face of horrible persecution and terrible times, because there were some men and women who said, orthodoxy or death. Did you know that used to be an old saying? Orthodoxy or death. With that kind of focus, that kind of commitment, there's no mountain of a difficulty bigger than what you're going to be able to overcome with a mustard seed of faith. That's the potency of a purposeful orthodoxy. You're going to say to that mountain of fear, go away. You're going to say to that mountain of doubt, go away. You're going to say to that mountain of worry, go away. You're going to say to that mountain of problems, I look at the greatest creator of the universe, not at my circumstances. Our parish is going to do the same thing. We are not going to focus on our weaknesses. We're going to focus on the Lord who is our strength. And we're going to accomplish all that God has called us to do in this place. It is going to happen if I have to hair lip every cow in Texas. Because we can have a mustard seed of faith and see the mountains of our challenges be completely blown away by the confidence, not in ourselves, but in the Lord who loves us more than we ourselves know how to love today. Is little faith keeping you locked away in mediocrity? Is a purposeful practice of your Orthodox faith seemingly too inconvenient? Or the fasting seasons seem to be too much? Are the feasting seasons coming on you, not even recognize it? By the way, you know next week we have a beautiful feast of the precious Dormition of the Theotokos. Is your faith active? If it is, we're going to buck the trend of folks not attending worship, because we're going to be a group of people who are awake to the most important thing in our life, and that is to have a mustard seed of faith so that the mountains of our difficulties are no match for our love for God. May God grant that to me and to you today. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.